I never saw it coming. At 11 years old, my world shattered with a single conversation. Mom and Dad sat me down in our living room, their faces serious. "Dakota, we need to talk," Dad began, his voice unnaturally steady. I remember thinking, this can't be good. My stomach twisted into knots. Mom took a deep breath. "Your father and I are getting divorced." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Divorced? But they never fought. They were always polite to each other. Sure, we hadn't been on family outings lately, but divorce? What? Why? I stammered, tears welling up in my eyes. Dad cleared his throat. "We've both found other people we want to be with." Mom reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "We'll still both be in your life, sweetie. You'll just live with each of us at different times." The next few days were a blur. I watched Dad pack his things, filling cardboard boxes with pieces of our life together. Mom busied herself redecorating, as if erasing Dad's presence would make it easier. Then came the day Mom's new husband moved in. He arrived with a truck full of furniture and a daughter a couple years younger than me. "Dakota, this is Tom and his daughter, Lily," Mom introduced them, her voice too cheerful. I forced a smile, thinking maybe this wouldn't be so bad. A sister might be fun. Lily looked me up and down, her lips curled in a slight sneer. "Nice to meet you," she said, her tone suggesting anything but. The next day, I tried to make friends with Lily. I offered to show her my favorite books and toys. She rolled her eyes. "Look, let's get one thing straight. We're not sisters, and we're not going to be friends. You're just in the way." As the days passed, I watched Mom dote on Lily. She bought her new clothes, praised her constantly, and even gave her some of my old toys. One evening, I overheard Mom and Tom discussing schools. "We should enroll Lily in Westbrook Academy," Mom said. "It's the best in the area." "What about Dakota?" Tom asked. There was a pause before Mom replied. "Dakota's doing fine at her current school. Lily's, well, she's gifted. She needs more challenge." I slunk back to my room, the words echoing in my head. Lily was gifted. I was just fine. As weeks turned into months, I felt increasingly out of place. Mom and Tom were creating their perfect little family, and I was the odd one out. The day finally came for me to visit Dad. I packed my bag with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Maybe things would be better at his new place. Dad picked me up in his car, and we drove in awkward silence. Dad's new wife, Sarah, greeted us at the door. She was younger than Mom, with long blonde hair and a forced smile. "Welcome, Dakota," she said, her voice overly cheery. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." I nodded, not knowing what to say. The apartment smelled of incense and unfamiliar spices. Sarah led me to a tiny room that would be mine during visits. The next morning, Sarah was brewing some kind of tea in the kitchen. "Want to try some?" she offered. "It's a special blend from Tibet. Very spiritual." Reluctantly, I took a sip. It tasted bitter and strange. Within minutes, my throat started to itch, then burn. I began to cough, struggling to breathe. "Dad," I gasped, panic rising in my chest. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. It's just tea." But I couldn't stop coughing. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was drowning on dry land. "Sarah, call an ambulance," I heard Dad shout, his voice distant and muffled. "She's faking it," Sarah insisted. "Dakota, this attention-seeking behavior needs to stop." I couldn't respond. The world was fading to black around me. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, an oxygen mask on my face. Dad was there, looking pale and worried. "You had a severe allergic reaction," he explained. "The doctors said, they said if we'd waited any longer." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I'd almost died, because Sarah didn't believe me. When I was released from the hospital, we returned to Dad's apartment. Sarah was waiting, her arms crossed. "I think it's best if Dakota doesn't stay here anymore," she said coldly. She's too problematic. I looked at Dad, sure he would defend me. But he just stood there, silent and defeated. The drive back was silent. I waited for Dad to apologize, to promise he'd make things right. But he said nothing. I walked into the house, not bothering to say goodbye to Dad. Mom barely looked up from her magazine. "You're back early," she said, sounding almost annoyed. I went to my room without a word, closing the door behind me. I was alone, truly alone, and I had no idea how to fix it. The next few weeks were a blur of loneliness and confusion. At home, Lily continued to torment me, breaking my things and blaming me for it. One day, she accidentally knocked over a vase, sending water and flowers cascading across the floor. "Mom," she yelled. "Dakota broke your favorite vase." Before I could defend myself, Tom stormed in. "That's it, young lady," he growled at me. "Go to your room. No allowance this month to pay for the damage." I looked at Mom, silently pleading for her to believe me. But she just shook her head, disappointment clear on her face. As I sat in my room, tears streaming down my face, I realized I needed to find a way out. That's when I remembered Grandma, Dad's mom. She lived alone, taught at the local college, and had always been kind to me. Maybe she could help. Grandma's house was like stepping into another world. The moment I walked through her door, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Her house smelled of old books and freshly baked cookies. It was cozy, filled with overstuffed chairs and shelves upon shelves of books. "How about we have some tea and you tell me what's been going on?" Grandma suggested, leading me to the kitchen. For the first time in months, I felt safe enough to let it all out. I told her everything: the divorce, Mom's new family, Dad's abandonment, the incident at his apartment. Grandma listened patiently, her kind eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "Oh, Dakota. I'm so sorry you've been going through all this alone. You can come here whenever you need to. My door is always open to you." From that day on, Grandma's house became my refuge. I started spending more and more time there. We'd cook together, work in her garden, and best of all, read books from her vast collection. One evening, as we sat in her study, Grandma asked, "How are your grades, Dakota?" I shrugged. "Okay, I guess. Mom's more focused on Lily's schoolwork these days." Grandma's eyes narrowed. "Well, that won't do. How about I help you with your studies?" And so began our after-school tutoring sessions. Grandma, it turned out, was an amazing teacher. She made even the dullest subjects come alive with stories and real-world examples. As the weeks passed, I found myself staying over at Grandma's more often. At first, it was just weekends. Then it became a few nights a week. Before I knew it, I was practically living there full-time. The strange thing was, neither Mom nor Dad seemed to notice. When I did go home, Mom would ask absently, "Oh, were you at your father's?" And on the rare occasions I saw Dad, he'd assume I'd been with Mom. It was during one of these visits to Grandma's that things came to a head. I came home from school to find Grandma looking worried. "Dakota," she said, her voice serious. "There were some people from the guardianship service at your school today." My heart raced. "What? Why?" Grandma sighed. "Your teacher, Mrs. Johnson, went to your mother's house to discuss moving you to a class for gifted children. When she asked where you were, your mother said you were living with your father. Mrs. Johnson then called your father, who said you were living with your mother. She realized neither of them knew where you actually were." I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. "What's going to happen now?" "The guardianship service has allowed you to stay with me for now," Grandma explained. "But they're going to file a lawsuit to determine your official place of residence." That night, as I lay in bed at Grandma's house, I could hear her on the phone, her voice low and intense. She was fighting for me, I realized. For the first time in a long while, someone was putting me first. The courtroom was intimidating, all polished wood and stern faces. I saw Mom and Dad sitting on opposite sides, neither meeting my eyes. As I took my seat, I couldn't help but remember my friend Jessie, whose parents had divorced last year. They had fought tooth and nail over who would get custody, both desperate to have Jessie live with them. The judge, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose, called the hearing to order. "We're here today to determine the living arrangements for Dakota Miller," she announced. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. Instead of fighting over me, my parents started fighting to get rid of me. "She should live with her mother," Dad shouted, his face red. "I've got a new family now. We don't have room for her." Mom jumped to her feet, her voice shrill. "Oh no, you don't. I have a life too, you know. I can't be expected to take care of her full time." I sat there, stunned, as my parents argued about who didn't want me more. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how much they were hurting me. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Order," she shouted, silencing my bickering parents. She turned to me, her eyes softening slightly. "Dakota, I'm very sorry you're going through this." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That's when I heard a chair scrape behind me, and Grandma's voice rang out clear and strong. "Your Honor," she said, standing tall, despite her age. "If I may speak?" The judge nodded, and Grandma continued. "It's clear that neither of Dakota's parents are willing or able to provide her with the home she deserves. I am her grandmother, and I am more than willing to take full custody of her." She approached the bench, handing over a stack of documents. "These papers show that I am financially stable. I'm a professor at Westfield College, with a good salary and substantial savings. More importantly, I love Dakota and want to give her the stable, loving home she needs." The judge looked over the papers, nodding slowly. Then she turned to me. "Dakota, you're 14 now. Old enough to have a say in this decision. Who would you like to live with?" I stood up, my legs shaking slightly. I looked at Mom and Dad, seeing the relief in their eyes at the prospect of being rid of me. Then I turned to Grandma, who smiled encouragingly. "I want to live with my grandmother," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The judge nodded. "Very well. Given the unusual circumstances of this case, and the clear wishes of the child, I'm granting full custody to Mrs. Eleanor Miller, with visitation rights for the parents if they so choose." Living with Grandma was like stepping into a warm bath after being out in the cold. We fell into a comfortable routine, gardening in the mornings, studying in the afternoons, and baking cookies in the evenings. Under her care, I flourished. My grades improved, I made new friends at school, and slowly, the pain of my parents' rejection began to fade. The years flew by, and before I knew it, I was standing in my cap and gown, diploma in hand. The journey to this moment had been long and sometimes difficult, but as I searched the crowd of proud parents and beaming relatives, I only had eyes for one person, Grandma. There she was, in the front row, her eyes shining with tears of joy. She stood out among the younger parents, but to me, she was the most beautiful person there. As I walked across the stage, I heard her loud cheer, "That's my girl." The absence of my parents was a dull ache, but one I'd grown used to. They hadn't called on my birthdays, hadn't asked about my college plans, hadn't shown any interest in my life at all. But looking at Grandma's proud face, I realized I didn't need them. I had all the family I needed right here. Thanks to Grandma's unwavering support and my own hard work, I'd not only graduated with honors but also secured a full scholarship to Westfield College, one of the best in the state. I was going to study investment management, a field that fascinated me with its blend of mathematics, psychology, and strategy. The next 3 years were a whirlwind of classes, study sessions, and new experiences. I threw myself into college life, joining clubs, making friends, and excelling in my studies. Grandma was always there, a phone call away, ready with words of encouragement or a care package full of her famous cookies. I was in the middle of my junior year when I got the call that changed everything. Grandma had passed away in her sleep. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as the news sank in. The following days were a blur of grief and responsibilities. I took charge of organizing the funeral, determined to give Grandma the send-off she deserved. As I made arrangements and wrote the eulogy, I was struck by how many lives she had touched. The day of the funeral arrived, and the church was packed. The mayor was there, along with several city council members, all former students of Grandma's. Famous authors and respected academics filled the pews, each with a story about how Grandma had inspired or helped them. As I stood to deliver the eulogy, my eyes scanned the crowd one last time. Despite a small, foolish hope, I knew I wouldn't see them. My parents hadn't come. They couldn't even be bothered to show up for the woman who had raised their daughter when they wouldn't. Eleanor Miller was more than just my grandmother, I began, my voice steady, despite the lump in my throat. She was my guardian, my teacher, my biggest supporter, and my best friend. After the service, as I accepted condolences from the long line of mourners, I thought about calling my parents, about screaming at them for their absence, for their years of neglect. But as I looked around at all the people whose lives Grandma had touched, I realized something. My parents' absence said more about them than it ever could about me or Grandma. 2 weeks after Grandma's funeral, I was called to the notary office. As I walked in, my heart skipped a beat. There, sitting on opposite sides of the room, were my parents. They nodded curtly at me, not even bothering to ask how I'd been. The air was thick with tension and unspoken words. The notary, a balding man with kind eyes, cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" he asked, looking around the room. As he started reading Grandma's will, I felt a sense of unreality wash over me. To my beloved granddaughter, Dakota Miller, I leave my entire estate, including my house and all my savings, amounting to $1 million. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into chaos. "What?" my father shouted, his face turning red. "That's impossible. I'm her only son. She can't just leave everything to Dakota." My mother chimed in, her voice shrill. "Surely there's some mistake. Eleanor could have at least left something for us. We're family too." I sat there, stunned. $1 million and the house? It was more than I could have ever imagined. The notary raised his hand, silencing my parents. "There's more," he said. Mrs. Miller left a letter to be read at this time. He pulled out an envelope and began to read. "My dearest Dakota. If this letter is being read, it means I'm no longer with you. But please know that my love for you extends beyond this life. You are the daughter of my heart, the only one who truly cared for me in my final years. To my son and his ex-wife, I am deeply disappointed in the way you abandoned Dakota. A child is a blessing, not a burden to be cast aside when inconvenient. Your actions have shown me that you do not deserve to benefit from my life's work. I know this decision may upset you, but it is final and legally binding. Dakota, use this inheritance wisely. Build the life you deserve, the life I always knew you could have. All my love, Grandma." The room fell silent again, but only for a moment. Then my parents turned to me, their eyes suddenly friendly, their voices honey-sweet. "Dakota, sweetie," my mother cooed. "Surely you'll share some of this with us? We're family, after all." My father nodded eagerly. Yes. Let's discuss this reasonably. We can come to some sort of arrangement." But I was already walking towards the door. "Thank you for your time," I said to the notary. "I'll be in touch about the necessary paperwork." As I walked out, I could hear my parents' angry shouts behind me. But for the first time in years, their words couldn't touch me. Grandma had given me more than just money and a house. She'd given me the strength to stand on my own, to face the world without flinching. A few days after the will reading, my phone rang. I wasn't surprised to see my mother's number on the screen. With some hesitation, I answered. "Dakota, sweetie," my mother's voice was syrupy sweet. "It's been so long. We miss you terribly. Won't you come for dinner?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Years of silence, and now suddenly they missed me? But curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to come. The next evening, I found myself standing on the porch of my childhood home, a place that now felt alien to me. My mother opened the door, her face arranged in a mask of maternal joy. I noticed the tears in her eyes, carefully crafted for maximum effect. Tom, her husband, and Lily, my stepsister, stood behind her, pasting on smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Throughout dinner, the conversation was strained. My mother kept bringing up how difficult things had been lately. "The house is just falling apart," she sighed dramatically. "The roof needs replacing, the plumbing is a nightmare. And poor Lily, she so wants to go to a good college, but with our finances." I pretended not to notice the pointed looks and unsubtle hints. I asked about their lives, their work, feigning interest as they stumbled through responses, clearly unprepared for actual conversation. Finally, my mother turned to me, her eyes wide with faux concern. "And you, Dakota? How have you been? What have you been up to all these years?" I smiled, deciding to test her. "Oh, I've been doing well. I'm in my final year of college now. By the way, do you know where I'm studying or what I'm studying for?" The color drained from her face. Tom and Lily shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Well, that is," my mother stammered. "It's okay, Mom," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You don't need to pretend. I know you're not interested in me. You're interested in my inheritance." The facade crumbled instantly. My mother's face contorted with anger and embarrassment. Tom started to protest, while Lily muttered something under her breath. "Now, Dakota," my mother began, her voice hard. "That's not fair. We're family. We're just trying to reconnect." "No," I cut her off, standing up. "We're not family. Family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't ignore each other for years and then only reach out when there's money involved." I walked towards the door, their protests falling on deaf ears. As I walked out into the cool evening air, I heard their shouts behind me. But I didn't look back. With each step, I felt lighter, freer. A few days after the disastrous dinner with my mother, I found myself standing at my father's doorstep. The house was smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling in places. My father answered the door, his face a mixture of surprise and forced warmth. "Dakota," he said, ushering me in. "It's good to see you." Inside, I met my stepmother, Sarah. Her smile was brittle as she greeted me. "Welcome, Dakota. It's been so long." A young boy peeked out from behind Sarah's back, his eyes wide with curiosity. My half-brother, I realized with a start. He was about 8 years old, a living reminder of how much time had passed. "This is Michael," my father said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Say hello to your sister, Michael." Michael just stared, clearly confused by my sudden appearance in his life. As we sat in the living room, the conversation was strained. My father cleared his throat. "Dakota, we've been thinking. Michael here is very bright. We'd like to send him to Westbrook Academy. It's a prestigious school, but the tuition..." I could see where this was going. "And you thought I might be willing to pay for it?" I finished for him. My father had the decency to look embarrassed. "Well, you see, with your inheritance..." "Dad," I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. "Why are you only remembering me now? Why didn't you call on my birthdays? Or when I graduated high school? Or started college?" Before my father could answer, Sarah jumped in, her voice sharp. "Now listen here, young lady. We're family. You're obligated to help us. If you don't, we'll take you to court and demand our share." I couldn't help it, I laughed. "Actually," I said, once I'd composed myself, "according to the law, we're not family. You both abandoned me. Grandma was my legal guardian. You have no claim to anything." The color drained from their faces, replaced quickly by anger. My father started to sputter, but I was already heading for the door. As I left, I caught Michael's eye one last time. He looked confused and a little sad. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, none of this was his fault. Over the next few days, my phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages from both my parents. They begged, they threatened, they tried to guilt me. My mother sent a particularly dramatic message about impending homelessness due to debts. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I focused on my upcoming college graduation and my future plans. As I looked at my bank statement, seeing the inheritance from Grandma, I felt a sense of responsibility. This was a chance to make a real difference, to build the life Grandma had always wanted for me. But as I thought about my future, my mind kept drifting back to Michael. He was innocent in all of this, just a kid caught in the middle of adult problems. While I had no intention of giving money to my father or stepmother, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to help Michael in the future. It was something to consider. For now, though, I had my own path to forge. As I sat at my desk, researching investment opportunities and job prospects, I felt a sense of excitement. The world was open to me in a way it never had been before.